Hello, my name is Christy Sprague, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about herbicides and cover crops. One of the things that we're really starting to see is the uptick in the use of cover crops, and one of the challenges that we have really has to do with how do we manage weeds in those cover crops, as well as what cover crops can we plant when we're using herbicides in our crop rotations. As most of us know, there are several benefits to different cover crops. They can help with weed suppression, they can help cycle nutrients, they're good for ground cover, erosion control, there's all sorts of benefits. However, one of the challenges that we have with cover crops is really getting good establishment of cover crops. And when we talk about that, one of the things that, from my standpoint, that we look at is, there's the potential competition with weeds that are out there, as well as the incompatibility with certain herbicides. Basically, when we plant those cover crops, we might have some residues of herbicides from previous applications that might actually hinder that cover crop establishment. So what I'm going to talk about today is what herbicides can be used without affecting cover crop establishment. And we're going to look at a few different systems, looking at systems either within wheat or after wheat harvest, also potentially after planting soybeans, and also looking at interseeding some cover crops in corn. First of all, I'm going to talk about frost seeding clover in winter wheat. And the main reason I'm going to talk about this is probably one of the oldest practices that people have as far as getting a cover crop into their crop rotation. There are a lot of benefits to frost seeding clover into winter wheat. Some of those benefits are that they contribute to soil nitrogen. They also have the potential to decrease soil erosion, increase soil organic matter, tilth, and also the water holding capacity of that soil. And it may also help reduce weed pressure. Some of the issues is that, especially with clover, what is the tolerance of clover? In this case, we're going to be talking about red clover to different herbicide applications. And one of the biggest issues is there are really few herbicide choices. So what I'm going to cover today is some work that we did comparing fall versus spring herbicide applications in a system where we were frost seeding red clover into winter wheat. And here are some of the different herbicides that we looked at. We looked at them applied in the late fall, basically right after the winter wheat had emerged, and then also looked at them at a typical spring application timing for weed control in wheat. Some of the herbicides that we looked at are listed here. Very common ones that are commonly used in Michigan: Affinity Broadspec, Husky, Osprey, Powerflux, Clarity, 2,4-D ester, and then MCPA. In addition to the trade names of these herbicides, we have the different active ingredients listed, the use rates that we looked at, as well as the different herbicide site of action group numbers, so you can see where each one of these herbicides fall. In looking at these different herbicides, again, we applied them both in the fall and the spring. I do want to mention that 2,4-D ester cannot be used in the fall, but we were keeping it in there just as a comparison for how it affected red clover. So some of the results that we had, if we had made those herbicide applications in the fall, and then we looked at basically red clover or frost seeded red clover establishment as a function of clover injury, after that wheat had been harvested, and we're looking at it about 2 weeks after, we actually had very good establishment of most of the clover, and we just saw slight injury. So in general, most of our establishment would have been over 80%. You can see where some of these, the injury ratings are. And from our fall applications, everything was less than 20%, except for with Powerflux HL. This is a big contrast to what we saw with spring applications. You can see with our spring applications, the red clover injury went up substantially. In fact, all herbicide applications, with the exception of MCPA, caused significant injury to the red clover. And I'll show you a few pictures of what we saw. So in general, when we look at this graph, we can say that most of our fall applications prior to frost seeding clover showed that we had decent clover establishment, maybe kind of a little bit less with PowerFlex and potentially a little less with Osprey. And then if we look with spring, we can see that we had a tremendous amount of injury with all of the different herbicides that we looked at, with the exception of MCPA. So here are a couple pictures looking at Affinity Broadspec. Again, these are a premixture of 2 ALS inhibitors. If we applied that in the fall after winter wheat emergence, and then we frost seeded in the spring, we had good clover establishment. However, if we frost seeded and then made those herbicide applications at an early spring application timing when we would generally make them for weed control, you can see we had very poor establishment of red clover. We basically saw the same thing with Husky, which is another wheat herbicide that we use typically for broadleaf weed control in winter wheat. Good establishment from our fall applications and very poor establishment from our spring applications. One thing we did see was when we did apply it in the fall, in some cases, we might see some bleaching around the outside edges of the clover, and that's just a little bit of injury symptoms from that Husky application. But that injury did not equate to reduced stand. Next, we'll look at another couple common herbicides that are used, and these are typically used for grass weed control in winter wheat. One of these was Osprey. You can see we had fairly good establishment with our fall application and no establishment when we applied Osprey in the spring after frost seeding red clover. However, we do see potentially a little bit of a reduction, and as you saw from our graph, we had maybe a little bit more injury from that fall application. So maybe some caution should be taken if you're thinking about using Osprey in the fall, just knowing that you might see a slight reduction in stand, and basically the same thing as what we saw with PowerFlex. I would say that we are still seeing establishment of red clover, but from those fall applications, but we might be seeing a little bit less establishment than what we would see if we didn't apply a herbicide. And again, the spring applications, the clover did not tolerate the PowerFlex applied in the spring. So as we look at what potential herbicides we might be able to use, if we're thinking of frost seeding red clover in our winter wheat crop, you can see we've got a chart here. And pretty much as you look at our fall applications, any of the products that we looked at could be used with a fall application. However, I would give caution to Osprey and PowerFlex, and that we might see a slight reduction in the amount of, or the amount of biomass or the establishment of that clover. It will still establish, but it may just not be in as much number or growth. From our spring applications, pretty much any of our applications that we made in the spring killed the red clover with the exception of MCPA. We also continued some of this work looking at 2 other herbicides, Culex, which is a newer herbicide that contains a growth regulator and a group 2 ALS inhibitor. And when we looked at fall and spring applications, we saw that we could not plant red clover with either a fall or a spring application. And then there's 2 other herbicides, Axial XL and Axial Bold. Axial XL is a group 1 herbicide. Axial Bold is a premixture of 2 group 1 herbicides. And these are typically used for grass weed control, selective grass weed control in wheat. And we can apply those without having any issues with frost seeding red clover from either fall and or spring applications. So we've got a lot of herbicides that we can use in the fall if we're going to frost seed clover. If we're looking at applying a herbicide in the spring, pretty much we're limited to using MCPA, which will provide us a little bit of broadleaf weed control, and then also axial, XL, or axial bold, which would potentially give us some grass control. And some of those grasses that will provide some control of are things like roughstalk bluegrass and windgrass. And if you're looking for more information, the MSU Weed Control Guide, we have a section that really focuses on weed control in small grains, barley, and wheat. And in this section, each one of the products, we have some remarks and limitations sections. And this is where we highlight when you can actually incorporate red clover into that rotation. So for example, with Husky, our statement is red clover can be frost seeded after fall applications of Husky. We might see some initial leaf margin bleaching that may occur, but do not apply Husky in the spring if red clover is frost seeded. So with all the different products that we looked at, there are statements like that throughout the weed guide for many of those wheat products. The other place where growers can incorporate cover crops into their crop rotation is after wheat harvest. This last year we did a preliminary study that was looking at seeding several different cover crops after wheat harvest. And we conducted this at the Michigan State University Saginaw Valley Research and Extension Center near Richville, Michigan. Just to give you a little bit of background about this location, it's a clay loam soil with about 2.3% organic matter and a pH of 8.1. One of the things I also want to point out was from our spring applications of the herbicides to the time that we planted the cover crops, we received about 13.29 inches of rain. So we had good rainfall for incorporating or potentially moving some of those herbicides out of the seed establishment zone from where we were planting our cover crops. So we could potentially see more dissipation this past year because of the great amount of rain that we had compared to other years. So again, this is some of our preliminary research. And again, we looked at several of the different wheat herbicides that we typically use in Michigan. You can see several of these are the same ones that we looked at when we were looking at frost seeding red clover. A couple other ones I want to mention is Talinor, which is a newer herbicide that is very similar to Husky. Also looked at Stinger, and all the other ones are ones that we talked about previously. Again, we have the use rates and the different herbicide site of action group numbers for each one of these products. And these herbicides were all applied on May 7th. We seeded our cover crops on August 7th, right after, a week or so after wheat harvest. We did apply glyphosate to take care of any weeds that were out there prior to planting these cover crops. We looked at annual ryegrass seeded at 15 pounds per acre, cereal rye seeded at 90 pounds per acre, oats at 60 pounds per acre, crimson clover at 15 pounds per acre, and red clover at 8 pounds per acre. In addition, we looked at 4 other cover crops. We looked at dwarf Essex rapeseed at 6 pounds per acre, radish, and the radish variety that we looked at was Image and at 6 pounds per acre. We looked at mustard caliente at 8 pounds per acre, and then we seeded Austrian winter pea at 80 pounds per acre. When we looked at our biomass and establishment at the end of the season, there were really only 2 of the cover crops where we did see some slight reductions in biomass. So I'm going to spend a minute going through some of the results that we had. So from our preliminary results, based on our fall biomass, it looks like there are several cover crops that we can plant after any of these herbicide applications. Again, remember we had the herbicides applied in a typical timing in May to winter wheat, and we seeded our cover crops in August. And we had about 13 inches of rain, so just kind of keep that in mind. But when we look at this, we had very good establishment of annual ryegrass following any of the herbicides that we had applied, cereal rye, oats, crimson clover, and red clover. So from these preliminary results, I would say that any of those would be safe to plant after any of these herbicide applications. Again, we did see some reductions in the rapeseed. So right now I would give some caution to the use of Affinity Broadspec if you're planning on planting rapeseed after wheat harvest. Also Talinor, Osprey, Powerflex, Culex, and Stinger. Radishes and mustards all established well and all had biomass consistent to where there was not a herbicide applied. And then we did see some slight reduction in biomass in the winter pea after a Powerflex application. So again, this is just 1 year's research, some preliminary research where we had quite a bit of rain, but in general we had pretty good establishment of all of the different cover crop species that we applied after these herbicides. This next year, we're looking for some funding to continue this research and look at it under some different conditions, some different soil types, and then just like any year, some different potential rainfall patterns. The next study I would like to talk about is some work that we did in 2014 looking at drilling cover crops after soybean harvest and really looking at what effect some of our soil applied soybean herbicides have on cover crop establishment. And the main reason we're talking about this is that we really are promoting the use of pre-emergent soil applied herbicides in soybeans to help control some of the herbicide resistant weeds that we have out there. So in particular, we're using a lot of metribuzin to help control things like mare's tail or horseweed. We're also using a lot of products that contain the active ingredient flumioxazin and also sulfentrazone. Those would be the Valor and Valor premixes and all the Authority type products because those are very helpful in controlling things like water hemp, Palmer amaranth, other pigweed species, and they can give us some additional help in controlling mare's tail. So we have a lot of pre-emergence herbicides that we looked at. We tried to look at all these single active ingredients that are available that we can use pre-emergence in soybeans. Our applications were usually made in late May or early June. And we did this in a bare ground setting to make sure that we weren't having any take up of those herbicides by the soybean plants. So we looked at products like Classic, Pursuit, First Rate. All of these are group 2 herbicides. We looked at metribuzin. Again, this is a very popular herbicide for management of herbicide resistant mare's tail. We looked at Spartan and Valor. Again, these are very helpful in controlling resistant pigweed species, as well as they can also add control of mare's tail. And also Zidua, which is a group 15 herbicide that does have good activity on many of our resistant pigweed species. Other herbicides we looked at were some different premixtures that contained sulfentrazone. Many of these premixtures are combinations of sulfentrazone with many of the other products that are single active ingredients above. We wanted to see how safe those were. So we had Authority Assist, Authority First, Authority Max, and Authority MTZ. And as you look at the screen, you can see what some of these different premixtures contained. The cover crops that we looked at were oilseed radish, medium red clover, and cereal rye. And you can see the seeding rates on this slide. And these cover crops were drilled approximately 100 days after our post-emergence herbicide application. When we look at oilseed radish and we're looking at tolerance, we basically saw a fairly good safety in that we had good oilseed radish establishment, with the exception of having a little bit of injury that ranged from 15 to 38% with Authority Max at 8 ounces or Spartan at 12 ounces. Remember, Authority Max would also contain the same active ingredient as Spartan. So maybe some slight injury. You can see the picture here where we see some kind of yellowing of those veins, and we saw some biomass reduction there. And this would be evaluations that we took 20 days after planting. When we look at any other of the treatments, we didn't see any differences in any of the treatments in regards to standard biomass compared to the untreated control. So really what we saw was just a little bit of that bleaching from the Authority Max and the Spartan. The next one we're going to look at is medium red clover tolerance. And with this, we saw injury that ranged from 10 to 50%. And again, it was with the same two herbicides, Authority Max and Spartan. And again, the sulfentrazone, which is the Spartan, is the single active ingredient of, or Authority, excuse me, the sulfentrazone is the single active ingredient of Spartan, but it is also in the Authority Max premix. We had our lowest biomass in the spring from those, but they were not different than the control. When we look at any of the other treatments, we didn't see any differences in red clover biomass compared with the untreated control. So in general, fairly good safety with the exception of those two products. The other thing we looked at again was cereal rye. And with cereal rye, everything established well, grew well, and we basically had less than 5% injury with any of the treatments. And we had no differences in cereal ryegrass stand, or excuse me, cereal rye stand or biomass. So when we look at all these different herbicides and trying to determine whether we can apply them prior to seeding some of these cover crops, you will see that with radish, basically I would say that we were fairly safe with any of those herbicides except for the high rate of Spartan or potentially Authority Max, which I would give it caution. If you're going to seed radish, you might see some injury. Clover, basically the same thing. A lot of those herbicides broke down and we had good clover establishment and growth, with a little bit of caution again with the same high rate of Spartan or with Authority Max. When we look at cereal rye, everything established well after any of the herbicide applications. So we do have a fairly good crop or cover crop safety after using some of these soil applied products pre-emergence prior to soybean planting. The next area of research I'd like to cover is looking at broadcast interseeding cover crops into corn, because that is where we're actually putting the cover crop in a much closer time window with some of those different herbicide applications. So we've done a lot of work looking at that from a pre-emergent side as far as what products might be used soil applied, and then others that might be used early post-emergence. In fact, this was a portion of a graduate student, Dr. Aaron Brooker, he just finished, in collaboration with Karen Renner and myself. The interseeding experiments that Aaron looked at were 3 years at the MSU Agronomy Farm in East Lansing. We looked at 3 different years at Hasnick Farms in Springport. Really would like to thank Mark and Drew for their help on that. And then also at the Saginaw Valley Research and Extension Center in Richville in 2018. So we had a wide range of soil types and a wide range of environmental conditions that we're looking at. What we looked at from the pre-emergence herbicides, again, we had 7 different site years. We looked at every single active ingredient that can be used pre-emergence or soil applied in corn. And you can see the names of these different products, and they're all grouped based on herbicide site of action numbers. And many of these products aren't necessarily used by themselves pre-emergence, but a lot of them are used in different combinations in corn for weed control. So you can look through here and you can see many of the potential group 2 herbicides like Python and Resolve. We have a group 4 herbicide, Stinger. We have atrazine, which is very commonly used in corn, Sharpen, Harness, Outlook, Zidua, and Dual, all group 15 herbicides, typically used for pre-emergence or soil-applied grass control, and also gives us some control of different small-seeded broadleaf weeds like pigweeds. Bicyclopyrone, this is a active ingredient that is a component of the herbicide mixture Acuron, and we have Balance, Flex, and Callisto. So again, all of the different active ingredients that we could potentially use in corn. In addition, we also did some early post applications. So when the corn was about V2 stage, and those, or V3 stage, those applications were made then. We had 4 site years for that. We looked at several different products that can be used at that time: atrazine, Buckdrill, Cadet, Warrant, Callisto, Lotus, Impact, Armazon, and then we looked at several premixtures that are commonly used at that same timing: Status, Callisto plus atrazine, and we looked at 2 different rates of atrazine, Armazon Pro, Caprino, and also Halix GT. The cover crops that we examined were annual ryegrass. Again, these are all broadcast interseeded at 15 pounds per acre of the annual ryegrass, and then tillage radish at 8 pounds per acre. Those broadcast interseedings happened approximately 2 weeks after planting when corn was at the V3 stage, or 5 weeks after planting when corn was at the V6 stage. And again, remember our early post applications when we were looking at those treatments would have occurred just prior to the V3 corn interseeding timing. When we look at annual ryegrass interseeded, basically what we saw is that annual ryegrass did not tolerate any of the group 15 herbicides, regardless of timing, whether it was interseeded at V3 or V6. And those group 15 herbicides are really our pre-emergence grass herbicides. So things like Harness, Warrant, Dual, 2 Magnum, Zidua, and Outlook. However, when we look at all the other herbicides, the herbicides that were safe to use prior to V3 or V6 interseeded annual ryegrass included ones that would give us some residual broadleaf weed control, as well as some that would potentially give us no residual weed control. And when we look at these, we have products like atrazine, Balance, Flex, bicyclopyrone, Callisto, Sharpen, and Stinger. And then also, again, Roundup and Liberty could be applied prior to that interseeding timing, but again, we would have no residual weed control. When we look at what kinds of weeds might be controlled by some of these different products, we could see that Balance Flex would provide us a little bit of grass control. We would see things like atrazine, Balance Flex, Callisto, and Sharpen would give us some residual water hemp, pigweed, and common lamb's quarters control. We would see that residual velvet leaf control from our HPPD inhibitors, Balance Flex, bicyclopyrone, Callisto, and also Sharpen. And then when we look at our early post-application timings, again, these happened prior to interseeding, we saw that atrazine, Callisto, Buckdrill, Cadet, Roundup, and Liberty were all safe. The atrazine and Callisto would give us some post-emergence control, but also some residual broadleaf weed control. And then the other 4 herbicides would provide no residual weed control. So they would only control the weeds that were up at the time of the application. We did, however, see when we combined Callisto to atrazine, we saw a little bit more stand reduction, so a little bit of a synergistic effect, but in general, it was still safe. We would have saw about 30% stand reduction. When we look at interseeded tillage radish did not tolerate the group 2 herbicides. These were Python, Resolve, and Caprino. The herbicides that were safe to use prior to V3 interseeding of tillage radish were atrazine, bicyclopyrone, Sharpen, Stinger, also Roundup and Liberty. We had residual weed control of the first 4 herbicides that we looked at. We looked at post-emergence herbicides that we could use. Basically, these were Bucktrill, Armazon/Impact, Roundup, and Liberty. When we had much more herbicides that we could use if we delayed our interseeding timing to V6 corn. So it gave us a little bit more time for those herbicides to break down. These herbicides that were safe to use, again, prior to interseeding at V6 stage of radish, were ones that would give us residual broadleaf weed control like atrazine, Balance Flex, bicyclopyrone, and Callisto. Our group 15 herbicides of Dual, Harness, and Outlook were safe. We also had residual broadleaf weed control from Sharpen and Stinger, and then also Roundup and Liberty could be used. And again, our Dual, Harness, and Outlook would give us some residual grass control. When we look at our early post timings, basically Bucktrill, Armazon/Impact, Roundup, and Liberty were safe. So very similar to what we saw with the V3 safety. So many times when people are looking at cover crops, they're not looking at single species. So what happens if we're looking at a cover crop mixture of annual ryegrass and tillage radish? Well, when we look at our soil applied herbicides, the only herbicides that would be safe to be used pre-emergence prior to interseeding at the V3 or V6 corn of annual ryegrass and tillage radish would be atrazine, bicyclopyrone, Sharpen, Stinger, Roundup, or Liberty. At the V6 only stage, we could use Balance Flex or Callisto. If we're looking at making an early post-emergence application and wanting to interseed annual ryegrass and tillage, we would be able to use Bucktrill, Roundup, or Liberty. So basically, none of those herbicides would give us any residual weed control later in the season. In order to kind of get you this information maybe a little bit more in a more user form, we have made a fact sheet that's called Herbicide Options for Cover Crops Interseeded in Corn. That fact sheet can be found on our website, msuweeds.com. It can also be found in the back of the MSU Weed Control Guide, and in the 2020 guide, that would be on page 223. And it can also be found on the Midwest Cover Crop Council's website. So again, one of our resources that you can look at is our website, msuweeds.com. That'll there's a lot of information there on cover crops that we can use after some of these herbicide applications. You can find much of this information in our 2020 Weed Control Guide for Field Crops, which is posted online or can be purchased. And then again, these will continue to be updated. And finally, I'd really like to acknowledge our collaborators, Dean Boss, Dr. Karen Renner, Dr. Aaron Brooker, Dr. Aaron Hill, for all their collaborations. This has been a group effort in looking at this, as well as like to acknowledge a lot of the funding sources that have went into a lot of this work. Project Green, the Corn Marketing Program of Michigan, the Michigan Wheat Program, and the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee. With that, I thank you for your time and attention.